Dear Arbury Road community, welcome to this podcast. This podcast is going to be quite particular as we are going to have lots of guests, more than usual actually. This podcast is going to be on the startup world in Europe in the broader sense, because one of our guests, though he has a European citizenship, is in Switzerland. So you have seen maybe the article we published some months ago about where we try to understand how far actually the startup world is really a result of neoliberal politics or of public investments. And now we want to have a look beyond data, a look that focus on experiences of people, of men working in this sector. So, and I said men's and not women, because unfortunately, actually the sector is dominated by men, as we will see further on in the podcast. But first of all, I would like our guests to introduce themselves. We start from the south, which is the guests from Italy. Then we go on to our guests from Switzerland and end with a guest from Berlin, the startup city of the European continent. So, Giacomo, thank you very much for coming.
Hi, Arturo. Thank you very much for hosting this podcast first and for inviting me.
You may introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'll start straightforward. Okay, great. I'm Giacomo. I'm from Italy, actually from Milan, specifically. I've been based here forever, I would say. So since I was born here, I've been studying here, I've been working here, but I've been working remotely, let's say, for different startups. First of all, I started with Movit. Movit is a startup based in Israel. It was founded back in 2011, 2012, and it is now part of the Intel group because Intel bought it for something like 900 millions, if I'm not wrong, something like this, a very big amount, something I was not aware of until the very last day. And it was great because I was 22 only when we were both, and I had started when I was 19 there. I was a community member first, so everything started at a party, when the managers start trying to understand about the market, if they can start working there. And I joined this community, getting there and having a drink with these managers, and I understood. I was so interested in understanding more the way transportation was managed in Italy, and the way Movit was trying to make an user experience much better and improved for the users of public transportation, that I got super involved with them, first as a volunteer and then as an operation manager. And still today, I'm an operation manager at another startup based here in Milan, which is called Nibble, working to put together a lot of workspaces for freelancers and for people now working remotely. I would pass the word to Bastian.
Actually, I think it's Martin first when we go from south to north. So I would pass again to Martin for now.
Right. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. So my name is Martin. I studied in Lausanne, and we started a company there, working on a very Swiss approach to activity monitoring in buildings. So we did want to be precise and discrete. So we did it through sensors that are embedded in the flooring. The company grew and is still growing. So we reached the 50 employees mark not so long ago. I'm not operative in that company anymore, and I'm embarking after my PhD in Zurich that I just fulfilled a few weeks back on a new startup journey. So I hope I'll have some interesting insight for this discussion today.
Okay, then I think I will continue. Thanks for introducing you. Nice to get to know you. Thanks for inviting me, Arturo. My name is Bastian. I'm living in Berlin. I'm from Germany and moved to Berlin to study. To be more precise, I moved to Potsdam, but lived in Berlin throughout studying. I studied IT systems engineering, so something related to software engineering, but bit more practical than the classic computer science studies. And in 2019, I got in very close contact with a startup. I was kind of the first employee. I received a public grant, which probably we will talk about later on. So I received some public money for helping two others found a company. By now, they expanded to being 3 founders now, and I think they have actually like 25 employees now. So they grew quite a bit since 2019 or 2020 when I joined. So yeah, I have some anecdotal experience in the early stages of the product development and also the outreach, the first steps towards getting both public money and private money into a startup. And as Arturo also said, Berlin is kind of one of these cities probably where there's a lot of stuff going on in the startup sector in Europe. So also right now I'm basically in the process of finding probably a new job also in the startup sector because I finished my studies and also pursued a PhD for a short time, which I then for now put aside. So yeah, there's probably some interesting things to tell from my side and also really to learn from you guys here in that call. So I'm very looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you for introducing yourself. Now we'll start introducing the data. And the most important thing, I believe, when introducing data is where can you find it. And I would like to give you an overview of the strategy of the European Union, actually. There is a Startup European Initiative, which as one of the main goals has actually sharing information. For example, you can find lots of information about the startups in the Startup Projects, which is an online platform with full of data that was collected on behalf of the European Commission and which can be found. Now, the strategy of the European Commission, I will just give some input on that, is basically the national standard which aims to focus in making it easier to launch startup and expand across borders. So having a facilitated visa for talented peoples, for example. Then there is the innovation radar that is part of the strategy, giving access to information and knowing where to invest, more to see also in which actually universities or which private companies may have the potential to develop a successful company. And then the DISC part, that is the one less self-explaining, digital startup in the Central Europe, Eastern and South Eastern Europe, is actually to counterbalance a disequilibrium, because at the moment in Northern European countries, startups is much more an issue than it is in the Southern Europe. So I'll ask you, and you can intervene or not intervene. Have you had already some contact with one of these projects of the European Commission? You probably had, but the question is, were you aware of it or not?
From the south to the north, I'm taking the mic. Not in my case. In my case, no. It's completely new for me, and it's very interesting because I didn't know about it, and I would like to learn more about it. And I'm scared we are kind of, at least from my point of view, so someone who was like put in the startup world from zero, so without any specific culture and without knowing about it before starting. There's much more the knowledge around the venture capitalism form from the American point of view, let's say, from the private point of view. And to learn about these tools, it's very, very enlightening, because it's something new from the worldwide point of view, let's say. So very interesting, but I didn't know.
Maybe there is a question related to this project which I like to ask you, which is all of you. Have you really experienced yourself an imbalance regarding the geographical distribution of startups? I mean, do you know many startups? Maybe Giacomo, have you seen that in the Northern world there is more support? Have you seen that there are more startups flourishing? Or Bastian, how many persons have you met maybe from Scandinavia having a startups but not from Greek? And the same question to Martin. Did you have some relations also with other where you could really feel here there is an imbalance?
Maybe if I can jump in for the Swiss element. So I think we have similar tools in Switzerland. Obviously, everything is scaled down in terms of numbers, so things become much easier to connect and keep an eye on these events. Across Switzerland, maybe those dynamics are somewhat similar as you would expect or as you see in Europe. It's you can really see how important regional tools are to foster innovation and boost at least the starting phase of startups. We have always based our the two ideas are technology based, so we've been in contact through, let's say, frameworks that are around for research and innovation, which then obviously touches upon European tools. I would say though that we very rapidly then have to look at where markets are. So if you want to expand or grow as a Swiss startup, you look at where to grow in Europe, and then very rapidly would, depending on the product, guide you in one direction, either north or maybe south. But so in Switzerland we have similar tools, not that much of a gradient in terms of company creation, but I guess that will be different in Europe.
Let's say that in Switzerland, it's easier also to have homogeneity, as there is only one state, and also the surface and population are much smaller. I just move on. You can always come back if you have something to add. Well, these are just some example of projects where basically the European Commission, of course, doesn't take everything centralized, but it fosters actually startups that, for example, help connecting other startups and diffusing data. One example are some example are given here in the slides for the one seeing it, but it's Scale Up for Europe or Startup Free X Europe. These are startups working actually on creating a better connection environment.
Maybe I can add something anecdotal to that point regarding the Horizon 2020 founded European projects that try to foster the interconnected development of companies, not only in one country, but maybe connected through Europe. With the startup that I worked in, where I was more than 2 years, we actually participated in one of these. It was called European Data Incubator, if I'm remembering it right. And it was also founded by the Horizon 2020 program. It was quite a good experience because we then had the chance to go to Bilbao in northern Spain to basically meet others there and to get connected with the program committee and the program members. So this was definitely, for me, a very good experience regarding the exchange of contacts, of networking, and also of ideas, and potentially also of investments between companies and startups from not only one country, but between European countries as a whole. So that was some anecdotal experience that I have there. Actually, I can't really say whether there was a very big decline or difference between northern and southern startups at that event. I think, if I remember it right, it wasn't that way that there were only like Scandinavian or Northern Europe companies there, but it was, to my mind, quite diverse. Although it's always a bit difficult to assess that based solely on some subjective matters that you might use if you are there. So it would be good to have objective statistics there and to have some actual data to look at.
But let's say that the fact that the meeting was taking place in Bilbao may also enter in the strategy of actually the European Union to counterbalance it. There is a good reason why it took place probably in Bilbao and not in Copenhagen. Actually, this is an interesting example of how, well, we had the idea that a market would bring together nations here in the European Union. This example shows that to bring together people, it's actually a synergy of free markets and the state intervening for such meetings. Maybe a reflection that can be further fostered by our hearer in the days after they hear the podcast. But let's move on. I was saying where you can find data. I already mentioned the European Startup Platform that you can simply find online, financed by the European institutions. But then there is also the startup European State of European Tech Report of 2021, which is referred also by the European institution, edited by Atomico, which is its own startup on its own. And most of information, even of this report, comes from Dealroom. Dealroom. Is this something does this word mean something to you? Because it's actually the biggest, as far as I know, the biggest European player when it comes of analysis and presentation of data regarding the startup world. It is used both by governments as, for example, of VCs or journalists. Apparently, you still have not encountered, but so we will be prepared for the next time. So we'll jump into the data, and I read a little bit for the hearer. Actually, here we have the first one, and we are to the issue I mentioned at the beginning. The data we see here is share of individuals by gender and functions, where we have as founders 86% being men's, 75% of leaders being men's again, which encounter means 50% of the founders are women and 25% only of the leaders are women. As I said, data from the European State of European Tech 2021, if somebody wants to go deeper in it. Now my question to you, does this data reflect your experience? It certainly does mine. As you see, we are all men here at the moment.
Again, I'm taking the mic from the south first. Thanks for this. I agree. I have the same feeling. And while you were asking us to reflect on this before we started the podcast, I said to myself, okay, I cannot list a single woman as a CEO of a startup at the moment in like 30 seconds. I cannot. So this is a shame. And maybe it's my limit, but I cannot. I want to be sincere. And in our particular case, taking my very small startup I'm working at, we have 14 people. We have 3 female employees at the moment active. And let's remember, we are a startup very much digital based, but this doesn't mean anything, but maybe it doesn't mean anything in the average, but in Italy is something very much common for what I know. So to have not so many females active in a startup, which is mainly digital. And this is a shame again. Something I wanted to add to what you said, Arturo, about the Dealroom, for the data, is that once again, I'm taking as a reference the Crunchbase for this kind of analysis. And again, something which is coming from the US. So this is maybe scary about the way we take our tools, our internal tools from the, let's say, region point of view. But again, 3 answers from me, all of them, they are negative, unfortunately.
Yes, so if I can chip in Swiss information. So in preparation of today, I checked the latest figures on the proportion of female founders in Switzerland. And so we're looking at 25%, which is a value that has kept increasing, but so we're still roughly in the same water is here as the average European number for, again, tech companies. My own personal experience participating in an accelerator was that this figure seemed much more balanced during those accelerator programs. In some cases, this is simply due because, well, there has been a quota used to foster female founders. But again, the overall numbers are 25% female founders in Switzerland.
I can share my experiences as well. Regarding the 25%, I have something about that as well, because the company that I worked at, the startup, is right now at 25% female and 75% male. So none of the founders, unfortunately, is female, and still now with 25 employees, it's still only at 25% roundabout. So there's definitely some room to improve there. Also anecdotal from my experience, when I was in some co-working spaces during the time that I worked at the startup, and we switched place from time to time, and also were part of some kind of these incubator programs where you get a combination of some money and also a place to work at. I definitely came in contact with a few startups where there were at least female founders involved. I I think also 1 or 2 startups actually where the whole team of founders were women. Although I do have the impression that the criteria of the State of European Tech, as it's stated on the slide, regarding the focus of focusing on tech or maybe even deep tech startups might lead to some kind of skewed numbers. Not that I want to like say that they are good, they should definitely be improved, but I think it depends really on which kind of startups and which kind of companies you look at. Because if you look at these very technical and coming from the STEM fields, from the natural sciences fields, if you look at these startups, then unfortunately there probably is that very large and unfortunate gap, also due to the same gap that we basically have in people studying in these fields and by people pursuing these career paths as a whole. So I think some of the problems that kind of show up in these statistics and that are definitely that we definitely have to tackle are coming from very underlying issues that should be resolved as well, like allowing more people and opening up these fields for people to start studying in that direction, for instance, or to go into the academic or work path that leads to basically often founding such a startup. So I think there definitely are those problems, that there is a lack of diversity, and I think the problems coming from very different areas and should be addressed at several areas at once.
Thank you, Bastian. Actually, understanding ourselves at Arbury Road as a think tank, it's very good to hear also some seeds of thoughts about how to solve the problem, which you actually gave now with the reflection about the fact that in tech studies, there is a concentration of an imbalance of men and women that should be tackled, and this would have also consequences then on founders' numbers. I would like also the others maybe to hear if you have some ideas, some reflection how the problem could be tackled. But before that, I would just like to do a question to enter a little bit more in detail to one of the things you said. Actually, Martin, you spoke of accelerator programs. I'm sure to our hearers, this is not a program known from daily life. So maybe you can spend some words about it, describing how it works.
Sure. So there is this one format in Switzerland that is basically a go-to program when you want to start really at the idea stage, which is called Venture Kick. It's a 3-stage process that in total will make you earn 130,000, whereby the last chunk is 100,000 investment in the company. The first 30,000 are basically equity-free money, and they accompany you over the stretch of a year, roughly. So they really accompany you from idea to essentially MVP or first customers in that sense. And this really is open to all fields, although there is I would say, a large proportion of tech companies in there as well. And this obviously is a tool that can let's say, control the proportion of women in the program, and so this certainly has helped in the emergence of some female founders and female CEOs in those batches. So it's limited to a certain number. Then there is another format, which is in fact the one that helped us start our company, where we really were even before the Venture Kick stage, which was the start contest in Lausanne. And this, I believe, maybe could also be somewhat of a seed for finding a solution here. The format of start is happening on the campus in Lausanne, which hosts both the business school as well as the technical university. And I believe merging different fields, because in the end you might be a tech company, but you will need people from all backgrounds and profiles. Merging those fields where indeed we have a better representation of women during studies might be a good indication, a good start to have more mixed teams when starting a company. Even getting, let's say, looking at what the initial thought was before creating a company? Was it an engineer that had a product in mind, or was it somebody who saw a problem, not forcing you with a tech background, and then started the company? So I believe really merging very early on different profiles in a startup weekend kind of format might help in getting at least more mixed teams, both in terms of background and in terms of gender.
So let me further ask on this point on accelerators, then we'll move back to the women issue and then further on. So it's basically two things you're speaking. The one is really events organized by universities, public entities with to put in contact people to like awake interest of students, of growing minds for startups. And the other is a kind of kickstart economic impulse given by public institution as well. It could be defined already as a seed founding ground, so to say. So ideas that are founded by public institutions. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, then Giacomo, did you have some ideas how to tackle the problem of gender inequality in startups?
I'm coming from Italy, and this is much more like a cultural problem from under many aspects. So this is the main thing that bothers me when I think about how this will be fixed up in the near future. So for sure, the cultural issue will remain and will take long. Will take long because at the moment, for sure, STEM females there are not many, but there are more and more. So for sure, there are people who want to work in startups, digital startups, and they have the capabilities to do that, and they are females. Maybe when they get in front of a person who should hire them, these people have the prejudice, at least in Italy, and they maybe decide to opt for a male figure doing the same stuff. This is maybe ugly, but it seems like it's true, and it seems like it's happening. So at the moment, at least for the Italian market, the very small I know, I would say it's much more about cultural change and to let people in the, let's say, in the small, medium enterprises world to let the managers understand they can bring more females on board, and they shouldn't worry about small concerns like the fact they might become pregnant. Because here in Italy, this is still an issue for them, and this is scary. So many things like this, they are only cultural issues, and they can be changed if we change the managers and the people hiring minds. So for sure, I would put my focus on that and promoting this. Going back to the other question, so the ways, let's say, I could see about how a startup was funded. So in my case, I was both lucky and unlucky to see the startup growing already when I joined. So both at Moveit and at Nibble, where I'm working now, they had already passed, in Nibble's cases, a lot of series of round of investments for sure. In Nibble, they went through an incubator first back in 2018, raising 150 k euros, and then in 2021 with private funds, but not seed yet. So we are still looking for the first seed round, the real seed round, and this should be planned for early 2023 and should be for something around the 2 million. But yet I'm not, I've never been so much involved in this part. That's a pity, but I cannot share a lot of details about it.
We're going to speak about funding also further on anyway, but yeah, of course, we have actually, let's say, some more superficial problems regarding only the state of the startup part, like more the technical part of daily life, where there is an imbalance of men and women. We have, which is tackled actually by Bastian contribution, saying, well, you should look also at how we can foster a technical a balance in technical studies. For example, we have the part where we have to push also women in the academic milieu when there is a stronger balance. We have to encourage the founding. And then, of course, Giacomo, as you pointed out, it's always difficult to speak of culture, but let's say that there is an historical inheritance we have in Europe, in the whole of Europe, as the data is showing, and we are all still imprisoned in some sexist kind of thinking, and this of course reflects in the gender payback, in the gender pay gap, and in many other branches as well as here. So we see it's a multi-layered problem that has to be tackled on different levels. I would move on. Actually, there is a further data about women in tech, but now I would like to focus on a more positive aspect, and this is actually how are startups performing in Europe. And here we have actually good figures in 2029, also due to the pandemic, which although it was a disaster for economy and for many personal history, it was actually pushed a lot the digital sector, and thus also startups. And we had a record of $100 billion of capitals invested, 98 new unicorns. Then we can maybe define unicorns. I leave that the pleasure to explain what a unicorn is and what is the importance of unicorns in the startup to you. But to give an idea how revolutionary this is, in the 7 years, there were, in the last 7 years, we had, in the first 7 years from 2010, we had like in Europe 10 unicorns, and the path in which they were founded increased really a lot. And the 98 in 1 year is really an amazing number. So there is a strong acceleration taking place. And we have also a strong increase in purpose-driven startups. Now, also the word of purpose-driven has a certain importance in the startup milieu, and it's difficult to define. I would like you maybe to tell some anecdotes about that. Exactly, there was, in the last year, there was an increase of 57% of purpose-driven. So quite a big one, according to the State of European Tech. So let's start again from the south, Giacomo, and yeah, the questions are actually on the slide, and now we are eager to learn of your experiences.
Again, you are asking an Italian one to talk about unicorns, and that's funny because we have one only at the moment in Italy, and many that might be unicorns from Italy, but they move their business since the beginning to other countries and mainly to other regions, so not Europe itself. So this is another scary situation for our market, but maybe that's okay for now. We should learn, and we will learn. So time to time, and maybe we will have our unicorns in Italy as well. In the meantime, something I can tell you about the culture around the startups here in Italy, at least, is still very much controversial, because you see people facing startups as an enemy, as a threat, sometimes when you talk with them about it. And they can be your colleagues at your company if you are working at a big corp. And then maybe you tell this to a friend, and a friend will adopt this kind of point of view, talking about startups. So once again, in Italy, it's a lot about being super conservative and about being very close. I mean, close to the new things and close to the new ideas. So in this case, I have bad feelings again. We will have to wait for new unicorns to start in Italy, to spread in Italy. By the way, we see many companies are running fast now, and I hope we will see many more to come.
One clarification before we speak too much about unicorns, and we are not speaking about the animal, but it's actually the definition for companies that are valued more than $1 billion. So, Martin.
Yeah, well, so also in preparation for our little chat here, so I looked at Swiss unicorns, and there is a fair number. I would say the majority that is in fact related to either healthcare or well-being technology. Healthcare, obviously, here being an inheritance of the large pharmaceutical industry in Switzerland. So those apparently leave space for small companies to grow very rapidly and reach quite rapidly a high valuation. Now, these are also areas where, in fact, the gender balance looks better than in other technical areas, where again we can make the correlation with also the number, the figures from let's say the studies. So typically, if you look at chemistry, biology, or pharmacology, have a much more balanced gender figure than let's say engineering studies. So I believe we can really break down this problem of seeing this imbalance in founders looking at the figures during studies. So yes, indeed, we as anecdotal. We were literally our first office was in a very small shed just outside of the campus in Lausanne, and it was maybe 100 meters away from the headquarters of MindMaze, which back in those days just became a unicorn. And this was the first the first unicorn then in Lausanne, I believe. And we certainly profited a lot from the press coverage that created. We could really feel before and after MindMaze in Lausanne on the campus. All of a sudden, everybody knew what a startup was, which wasn't the case. Everybody knew what a unicorn was. So that definitely gave a big push to the ecosystem. And at the same time, this allowed stories with also female founders to get more attention. So that was definitely a big push and a positive push. But again, it's the sector that allows for gender balance and not the system in itself. Then when it comes to purpose-driven, in fact, I'm more used to the term impact-driven. So I guess purpose-driven then leaves more room to interpretation to what it is. Yeah, definitely a big element here. Also because we see more and more tools and accelerators, such as the Safe Impact Academy, for instance, here in Zurich, that really focuses on impact-driven approaches. So I believe that the funding for those tools is what in the end then helps more of those impact-driven companies to flourish. Whether this is a solid trend, I believe it's probably too early, but it would be obviously a good thing to see founders being driven by, for instance, adapting and finding solutions to climate change as one big impact.
Yeah, let me, before Bastian starts with his anecdote, actually going in with some thoughts about the purpose-driven or impact-driven fact. Let's say that the economy, as we understood it in the last, since Adam Smith, so since the developing of capitalism, there is actually one driver for a company that should be doing profit. So if we want to be very positive about startups, we could say that it's also a sign that maybe we're changing a little bit our mind about how the world should work, that there it's not only about profit, but for example, also about sustainability. And so this, let me go in with the first definition of purpose-driven. This word is very difficult actually to parameterize, but let's try. It's actually that the purpose, the goal of the company is not just to make profit, but there is an idea, like to solve a problem. Of course, as I said, there is a kind of, let's say, I would call it conflict, but it's a personal opinion, of course, between how the capitalistic system works and was understood until now and this purpose-driven idea. And when I interviewed a founder some days ago, you can find more information on the article of Arbury Road about startups. He actually said that when the VC, the venture capitalists, so the investors, the people investing in the startup are private, it's difficult to remain purpose-driven. It's different if you have a state that is a kind of more idealistic. And he quotes the example of Airbnb, who started wanting to solving the problem in San Francisco of houses not used and houses needed, apartments needed. And at the end, they got lots of private financing. They had to produce profit. And now, well, we know that Airbnb has not only positive effects on the prices in cities. It's more the opposite. So these are just some thoughts about purpose-driven and a better definition. And now I'm eager to go on with the discussion. Sorry, Bastian, if I took the word away from you.
Oh, no, it's all right. Thanks for the introduction of purpose-driven investments or impact-driven. I think it's definitely a very important and meaningful part of today's founding. Yeah, maybe to start with German unicorns. I think there are quite some, probably more than 20. I don't know exactly. And as far as I know, some of them are even competing. So there's, for instance, Flink, as far as I know, and Gorillas, those delivery services for groceries, basically. And both of them being like having survived that kind of stage, and both of them being unicorns and still competing against each other, to my mind, leads to quite unhealthy situations from time to time, because usually these very hyper growth focused companies have to somehow put them into the market, usually by giving discounts to customers or by somehow subsidizing basically the cost that they would have through the investments that they get. For instance, Flixbus, one of the other unicorns, did that by basically kicking the others out of the market by offering very cheap and good prices, and thus gaining a lot of the market. And I think when multiple startups competing in the same space reach that stage, it can become really dangerous, because one of them probably wants to win against the other one, and there's either a merger that one company eats the other one basically, or they continue to put more investment in and put more in to basically keep prices down to be cheaper than the alternative. I think that sometimes leads to very unhealthy market situations. But yeah, as far as I said, there are some interesting unicorns in Germany. And regarding the purpose-driven investments, I'm very happy to see that, for instance, the Berlin Startup Stipendium, or a grant basically, that also I and others of the startup that I worked at received some kind of public funding here in Berlin, has expanded its definition and is now starting, for instance, to also invest in one project that I know of where people are basically founding a school and thus doing something in the social sector, which really doesn't fit on first sight into the classic definition of a growth and profit-oriented startup. And I think this kind of paradigm shift from solely commercially and solely financially oriented startups to startups being somehow bound to the environmental or social governance goals, like the ESG goals, is something that we definitely have to do in Europe. And it's good for me to see that it's starting to get put into practice. And I definitely want to see more of that, because I think it's definitely the task of our generation and of our century, basically, to get very good and purposeful and impactful organizations, be it startups or be it some other form of organization that basically solves the current goals and the current challenges and problems that we have regarding environment and social problems.
Well, if I can just chip in a small comment. So impact driven indeed is based on those ESGs. And then I think this contradiction between seeing social impact driven startups in a capitalistic setting is that is where the contradiction is, because we're trying to solve some of the problems that we created ourselves, whereas the climate impact driven solutions are not forcing you that much in a contradiction, but rather highlighting that climate compatible technologies can in fact be profitable. And this is typically the message of Solar Impulse Foundation here in Switzerland, that really wants to showcase clean technologies that are profitable, and then distributes labels or assigns labels to some of those solutions. This as a small side comment.
Yeah, of course, we had very good that we had the comments about the node of progressive state-driven politics from Berlin, with an enlargement of the definition of startup and a more positive view about liberal economy and the power it can yield coming from Switzerland. And here we see the plurality of the European Union. So actually time is flying, as always when we have fun. I would like maybe to have a look at the next slides awaiting us, just to have well, this is just about the capital invested in round by sites and by year. let me say, we already discussed this a lot, but what is the rounds? What are rounds and what are sides? Basically, the financing of startups is organized in rounds, and depending how much money the the company receives, it's called seeds round, which are the smallest because it's a seed, the round A, round B, then round mega and super round, and so on and so forth. But we see that actually from 2017 to 2021, the investment more than are increased than more than by a factor 4. I just go a little bit on in the presentation just to outline also exactly that you can see that there is actually a difference also in regions, that actually in Germany, the VC backed 1 billion European tech companies, the unicorns, are, you said, Basti, more than 20. It's actually more than 50 apparently, and a good amount VC backed, so venture capitalist is backed. Now I skip a little bit because the time is less, and I would like to have a look also at this slide where we see that while the European Union is still weak in many rounds when it comes about the founding of many rounds, like for example in the mega round plus, so more than 250 millions of euros, it's just 12% that Europe takes over the world financing. We have 47% of North America, which is not surprisingly. We all know the giant of digital tech coming from the USA. Asia with 39%, and the rest of the world with only 2%. So when I see this, the first thing I think of is also we have still a problem of calling the rest of the world because it's economically so weak, which shows that there are strong inequality we have to tackle. But what actually I would like you to comment is also the fact that in the seed round, so in the smallest round, Europe is the strongest area according to this division. So Europe with 38% beats North America that has only 36%, and 60% of Asia. This has also to do to the political restraint of startups of China in the last year. So actually, I really said a lot of things now. It was a little bit how our rounds organized. If you want to further elaborate this, of course, you're welcome. Seeds, Europe is strong in seeds. That's the second information. And the third one was a little bit where we saw fastly on the slide that there is still a strong geographical gradient action in Europe, and that some countries perform better than the others. So I would say let's follow again the south to north comments, and then we close down, and maybe we can do also another one if we have much to tell. But all nice things have an end, we say in Germany.
Well, I will go super fast, short, and maybe rude. But guys, it seems like funds from Europe are letting us, let's say, spend our money for marketing, and then as soon as we are known abroad or by someone else's, then we get the money from abroad, from very far away, and not from our region. This is actually what's happening with my very small startup. We are looking at another region to get then the Series A if everything will go very well. And this is again something very sad, but maybe I have not the correct vision because I'm not very keen on the finance perspective. So I will pass the mic from now.
Well, if I can, so this is a very interesting graph. Although the previous one that showed the distribution across Europe, it looks like the United Kingdom has nearly double the volume, or even more than double the volume than the second country, which is Germany. And this gap obviously is somewhat surprising if you think of, let's say, the technologies that are around, but it definitely also is maybe showing somehow mindset differences in those countries. Now, if we come back to the distribution of the rounds and the sizes of investment rounds, I don't think it is that surprising to see that the proportion of European rounds decreases as they increase, maybe simply because looking at the companies that are being founded and looking at the sizes that they desire to reach, typically Switzerland, just as Germany, I guess, are really typical SME companies. So once they've reached their maturity, which then is somewhere between 50 and 500 employees, that is where they can operate, and then we're not competing anymore with those mega rounds. What is surprising is indeed that the seed proportion is bigger than it is in North America, maybe because simply the Northern Americans are skipping the seed rounds more and more. So we're currently embarking on a startup journey that has to do with meat analogs and sort of the food sector. And so it is very impressive to see how much funding startups obtain in the US, in quotes, simply with an idea. So we definitely can see first rounds exceeding 4 million. So it's essentially, it looks like American startups already start with Series A, as they would be defined here in that chart. But what will be interesting is to see the proportion of, let's say, public and non-public seed money in those rounds, because there I really believe that we by now have strong tools in Europe to build companies, let's say, or at least to start them. That would be my take on that.
Yeah, I can also add a little, maybe, although I don't see a lot of information that I can quickly gain out of this chart. But actually, what is one thought that I have is that maybe the difference, the apparent difference in the seed stage being quite big in Europe, bigger than maybe even in North America, and then basically decreasing by if we go up the ladder of Series A, Series B, and so on, might also be related to maybe something that happens from time to time, to my mind, in Europe and, for instance, in Germany as well, regarding digital things and tech as a whole, that there is some kind of delay, which maybe over time gets like not compensated completely, but which just leads to some kind of delayed developments. And I think one guess basically explaining these this huge decrease of founding shares basically starting after the seed round might be that this is something that hasn't started as early as it did start in Northern America, for instance, in the European countries. So there might be some development in the future where then also Series A and Series B goes up, because these are just investments that might happen in a few years to the companies that have been seed founded a few years or maybe even this year. Although what Martin said, I think is definitely a very good point, that there is some focus on the small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs, and that they make up a big share or a big part of companies as a whole in Europe. And yeah, as Martin like very good said, they basically reach their size at a certain point, and it doesn't really make sense to grow bigger from that part on. Yeah, I can definitely also share or like I share the opinion on what Arturo said, that the so-called rest of the world, it's very unfortunate to have that crammed in there in that very small part, both like not having a further distinction and yeah, basically having that very small share is also definitely very unfortunate. So I think there's also a lot of room for improvement. Maybe something like the European Data Incubator that I talked about, connecting companies throughout Europe, something like this, maybe that already exists, but something like this on a global scale, that it would not only connect within Europe or within North America, but throughout these regions, and basically form kind of collaborations and try to bring people together from those different parts, could also be very interesting for basically all of the parts involved. Although then we still have to or quickly have to think about if you go into that part about like globalization, deglobalization, is it good to have that kind of collaboration, or is it even good to have some kind of separation there? I think, yeah, a lot of interesting questions in that space, which unfortunately don't fit all into this short podcast.
Say that the goal is,
yeah.
The goal is not to find answer, but to understand which are the questions for the next 20 years for us. And in that sense, Martin, you want to have a last comment, but then I will close down answering some of the questions you raised.
Right. So maybe just one comment is do we have a good understanding as to the regional activity of VCs in Europe? Because my own experience would tell me that also VCs have regionally limited outreach, not investing in maybe more than 2 or 3 countries in Europe, and then basically splitting it up and not making it a market big enough or comparable to, let's say, North America. Obviously, this might change now with the European investment tool that is being set up, but maybe this is also something that we can look at, geographical activity of VCs.
Yes, indeed. So we have actually many possible explanation. And for one of your question, Martin, I have also kind of an answer, I hope, on the other slides, which I'll now pick up. But so let's summarize a little bit the explanation, the possible explanation we give. It's the one for sure I share from Bastian, actually, that it's developing. As I show, the startup milieu, the startup environment increased a lot in the last years in Europe. So actually, we should expect our share to be simply deleted, but we should increase also in the others one. On the other part, of course, actually Europe is more a continent of SME. You said SME, maybe for the here, small and medium enterprises. And this, I believe, is also good for our society, not to have just giant player, but actually many small and medium enterprises. Actually, the support strategy of the commissions and many government focus on fostering these small and medium enterprises, and the startup initiative is part of the small and medium enterprises initiative. So this is part of the explanation for sure as well. You asked also about how much of the public funding is there. I think I'll have the possibility to answer a little bit that with the last slide. I did not mention the sources of this here. It's European startup. So this initiative fostered by the European Commission, then with in cooperation with private partners. And then we had actually also the slide which you quoted. Yeah, actually some information about Sifted. It's created by Sifted and Dealroom and supported by the European Commission and the Parliament. Here again, back to the State of the European Tech Report. Here you see some share of VC fund raised, and you see that the government agencies, for example, in Central European Europe, are making out a large percentage. We are speaking of almost 50% of funding, which is given by public institutions. It is not split into series, which would be, of course, very interesting. But as I said, these reports are online, can be looked at, and maybe there are also some more in detail information, especially the European Startup Project, as I said, which I mentioned before, has also interactive mappings which can be used. So, dear Arbury Road community, I think for today we are done. I hope you could actually bring home some seeds of thoughts about how the European startup scene is, and it seems to be quite well off, better off than it was 5 years ago anyway. And I hope that we could also reflect all together about what should be tackling, what should the politics be tackling in the next 20 years. I thank again very much our guest that connected to us from south to north of Europe. And well, I hope to hear and see you all soon.